So hello and welcome to this Good Grief event on collective grief. My name's Lucy Selman. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Bristol and the Founding Director of Good Grief Festival. And I'm really honoured to be joined today by Julia Samuel. It's great to see you, Julia.
Lovely to see you and lovely to see everybody joining us. That's so nice to have people with us.
Yeah, it's great. So Julia, as many of you will know, is one of the leading psychotherapists in the UK, and she's a good friend of Good Grief Festival. And she was awarded an MBE in 2015 for her services to bereaved children, and she's Vice President of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. And she's also authored 2 best-selling books, Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass.
3. Actually.
Oh, sorry, 3 now. Do you want to say a bit about your most...
My last one that came out this year was Every Family Has a Story, How We Inherit Love and Loss. Yeah.
Thank you. And as I was saying that, I thought, oh, I need to update this intro. So thank you all so much for joining us today. So at this time, after the Queen's death, we felt like it was really important to get together and talk about collective loss and grief and mourning, and how we can cope with these often difficult experiences at this time. And we're also aware that since Queen Elizabeth was a constant in our life for so long, her death brings home the inevitability of change and crisis. And many bereaved people might also be feeling triggers from their own bereavements. It might have brought up difficult emotions. So that was why we've wanted to invite you here today to talk about collective grief. Julia, where would you like to start? Shall we start with what is collective grief? What is it that we're talking about today?
I mean, I think, and I'd love to know what everyone joining us thinks too, is that I think psychologically the Queen, whether we were honest or not, because she's been so present in our lives, in the backdrop of our lives as a Queen for 70 years, and for most of us, all of our life, we have a relationship with her, whether we kind of know it or not. And because she has never given an interview and we don't know her, we only see her in her formal position as head of state and queen, and I think in some ways mother of the nation, allows us to project onto her whoever we want her to be psychologically, but also because she performs these roles of ceremonies all through the year and then comes out in crisis and gives speeches. For many of us, I think, without even knowing it, she represents safety, predictability, continuity. I mean, that doesn't include people who are very against royalty, but that, I think psychologically and I think she represents that. So I think it brings up our feelings of loss for that sense of safety and continuity, like, oh, what am I going to do without the Queen's Christmas speech? It's like, that it comes and it sort of feels like a loss. And it will also, I think she's also a kind of portal to our memories of our own life, so that we can remember particular significant days in relation to her and events in her life. So where we were on, say, the Silver Jubilee or certain weddings, and we can mark our life through her life. And as you were saying, I think a new loss, whatever the loss is, or whoever the person is, will always put us in touch with our own loss. Those losses that are resolved, because it just goes to the same place, but also unresolved losses that we haven't kind of done a lot of work on. And it brings us face to face with our mortality and death and dying, and coffins, they're very stark. And I don't think there's any other coffin that I know of. Normally coffins are quite private. You're at the church or in the crematorium and you see the coffin and you see it for a very short time, and then the service is over. We've seen the Queen's coffin for like a week now, or whatever long it is. This is exactly whenever we started seeing the coffin. And that's rather extraordinary that we've been given these symbols of death every day, 24/7 on the news. And that must bring up lots of feelings in us all.
And as you say, it's not even necessarily losses of someone who reminds us of the Queen. It's not necessarily that we're thinking of our mothers or our grandmothers. It's the sort of the triggering and the contemplation of all of the losses that we've experienced as human beings, including, I think, having come hot on the heels of the pandemic and all the losses associated with that. I mean, we were talking earlier about the coffin procession and how the coffin went past the COVID memorial wall. And
no, the people queuing to go to the Lambeth Gate walk past the COVID wall on Lambeth Bridge, yeah. So it's very kind of poignant. And I agree. And I think, I think some of the power of collective grief, when we have felt so fragmented and isolated and alone, is that in coming together in the way that hundreds of thousands of people have come together, we are mourning something in unity or someone in unity, and that we're coming together to share our loss for that person. And I think in the queues, people kind of meet strangers and become friends very quickly. And I think the single biggest protector or thing that we need most when we're grieving, as I've said many times on our webinars, is the love and connection to others. So I think there's something incredibly powerful of people coming together and witnessing together and sort of sharing their feelings together with strangers as well as family members. That is very healing. And of course, the structure of rituals has been what we have used for as long as we've been humans, millennia. Every country in the world, for as long as we know, have used rituals to give us a framework of how we manage both the death of the relationship with the person that has died and our relationship with our own mortality. Because grief is so messy and chaotic and unpredictable, the ritual, the ceremonies, the recognition of a coffin, they give us something that holds us and contains us and kind of helps support us manage the uncertainty and the fear that grief brings.
I want to talk a bit more about ritual, but just to rewind a little bit. So first of all, you've reminded me of my failure to do good housekeeping and tell everybody to please use the chat function to come together and let people know who you are and where you're from. But also, if you have any questions for Julia, please put them in the Q&A and they'll get fed through to me. And the second half of our discussion today will be, questions from the audience. I mean, we want to talk about ritual, and I think that's really important. But I wondered if, first of all, we could talk a bit more about the diversity of emotions that are coming up for people, because I think what we're seeing, certainly in the media, it can make people feel that they should be feeling a certain way, and that they should be mourning a certain way, or feeling sadness in a certain way and expressing that in quite a prescriptive way. And of course, as we've talked about before, grief is so individual, and how we might want to express how we're feeling is so individual. And there might also, as you alluded to, some people might be feeling nothing at all. Other people might be feeling some anger or, more conflicting emotions about, the role of the monarchy or the money that's being spent on the funeral. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that, about the sort of darker side, I suppose it is, of this kind of situation.
Yes, I mean, I think, we will always have a response and a feeling response, which will be informed by our own experience, our history of losses, and our personality. And so, I mean, I've certainly had messages from people who are furious. They feel like their loss, their grief, their mother that died is being usurped by somebody else. And why would one person have such high value and another person not be seen or acknowledged or known at all? So there's a kind of rage about that. which, you know, and I think the main message I want to get across, and I imagine you agree, but I'm interested to know what others think, is that there is no right or wrong way to feel, that we can't control what we feel. We may feel very sad, we may feel very angry, we may feel absolutely nothing and have absolutely no interest in this whatsoever, and kind of look at it from a distance, like, what on earth is going on? And what matters is what we do with what we feel, so that we don't criticize and turn on ourselves for having the wrong feelings or in some way responding in the wrong way. What is important is that our emotions are transmitters of information to tell us something is up, and for us to be able to be aware of what that information is, what is the feeling and the thinking that comes from that, and then to meet our need. What does that mean we need to do? Does it mean we need to talk to a friend and go for a walk? Does it mean we need to kind of have a hug? Does it mean that we need to watch football so that we don't watch, you know, everything that's on telly? Do we need to be distracted? Do we need to go back to work? Whatever it is, because when we allow our feelings to be expressed and named and released, it frees us to have other feelings, but also it maintains regulation. When we block them, we get tight, and then they come back and kind of can be stronger in us and turn against us.
Yeah, that's true. That's so true. And also potentially turn against each other.
Yes.
Or, you know, I think some people, you know, in their grief, they do find it difficult, don't they, that people deal with strong emotion in different ways. And at the moment, people are feeling so many different things. I suppose that's one danger, is that there can be sort of divisiveness around this.
And I think it's really key. I mean, I think for people listening, that also that happens in our own lives, in families. You can have 3 children and 2 parents, whoever they are, that respond entirely differently from each other. And each of them could look at the other and think, what is wrong with you? And that can cause a lot of conflict. And that when we find ways of having honest and open and collaborative communication, and we really allow difference, then we can narrow the gap of the difference by giving empathy and connection and understanding. And then that allows us as a family unit to kind of surf and manage the waves of the distress of the loss that we're feeling.
Thank you. I thought it was important to sort of acknowledge that as well, because there is such complexity, I think, in the emotions people are feeling at the moment. And then I did want to go back to, you know, you made a comment about the role of ritual and some of the ceremonies that we're seeing, and the sort of mourning practices that we're seeing in action at the moment, and the role of those in providing a sort of framework or maybe stability in the sort of chaos of grief. Could you say a little bit more about that, about how ritual provides that framework?
Well, I think at the moment of the death, we are thrown into this alien internal landscape. And if we don't have rituals, we don't have an external set of procedures and behaviors that can hold us together and contain us. And as you say, give us this scaffolding, if you like, a kind of framework to manage what can otherwise feel overwhelming, or that you feel completely stuck. I mean, if we didn't have rituals, it'd be like every time you have to reinvent what we're going to do. So I think they're really important. And also they create this opportunity to mark the life and then the death of the person that's died. It gives us a structure within which to say goodbye and witness each other saying goodbye, having a real kind of proper farewell. It enables us, it gives us an opportunity to come together, to be with others, to share your loss. And that was the devastating thing about COVID, and why it caused so much harm, was that people couldn't come together and share rituals and food and hugs, because they, you know, the single thing that people need most when love dies is the love and connection to others in all of its spectrum, in friendship, in neighborhoods, as well as in love within families. And I think, you know, and these rituals go back from as long as we know history. So the earliest in the UK, the earliest kind of burial stone is something called Lanyan Quoit, Quoit, and it's 4000 BC. And it's this enormous stone in Cornwall or Dorset. Maybe somebody knows. I think it's in, don't know where it is. I think it's somewhere in the southwest. And so we have always instinctively as human beings had to find external markers for our loss. And I do always think stones are particularly significant. You know, we have them as burial headstones. We have it in the cenotaph. We have it. And I often suggest to families and often children that when someone dies, that you may go and choose a stone and you have a little stone in your pocket that you can take to school or have with you, that you can use as a sort of soother, like a worry bead, but also as a connector to the person that's died, so you feel kind of warmer.
And I suppose, you know, when we talk about ritual, what strikes me as well is that we're tapping in there to our sort of deep wisdom of being a community, you know, our kind of cultural and historical wisdom of how to process and manage and, you know, properly deal with and process the grief. Because often, you know, when we're struck by a bereavement, you know, it might be something very powerful that we've never really experienced before. And if you have that, you know, the social structures of rituals and the scaffolding that, you know, that you talked about, it kind of helps you to, I think, sort of tap into that innate wisdom of being humans over time. You know, we've been doing this for so long, as you said.
Through globally, you know, there isn't a religion that doesn't have a funeral practice. And you were talking about different practices and rituals around death that you've kind of been looking at.
Yeah, I was doing a little bit of research, looking into some of the different kind of funeral and ceremony practices around the world, and there were a few which really stood out to me, and I'm sure many people here probably you know, have more expertise in this area than I do, but this one really struck me. So it's called the Tehana practice, and it's from the Malagasy people of Madagascar, and it's a funerary tradition where it's also called the turning of the bones. So once every 5 or 7 years, a family has a celebration at its ancestral crypt, where the bodies wrapped in cloth are exhumed and sprayed with wine or perfume. And as a band plays at the lively event, family members dance with the bodies. And for some, it's a chance to pass news to the deceased and ask for blessings. And for others, a time to remember and tell stories of the dead. And once the ceremony is ended, the bodies are then reburied back into the tombs. And I just thought it's such a kind of powerful way of integrating death and dying, and integrating those continuing relationships with the people who've died kind of into society and into our own thinking about what grief is and what death is.
And what it brought up for me was that, you know, grief is invisible, and after the person has been buried, there isn't any, you have to create touchstones to memory. You have to wear their piece of jewelry or cook their favorite meal, or, you know, find something that represents them. And these bones are those very tangible ways of connecting with them. And this whole idea, you know, from Phil Silverman, of continuing bonds, that the person has died, but the relationship and the love for that person never dies, that continues for as long as we live. And that's an incredible, important part of our grieving, is both to feel the loss and the pain that they've died and allow ourselves to feel the pain, but also to continue the relationship that, you know, most people talk about. I was talking to him, you know, I said to him this morning, or I visited the grave and I said to them. And from the Queen's perspective, one of the thoughts that occurred to me is that, you know, when I die, when people that have known me have died, then I will properly die. You know, I'll be completely forgotten, like most of us will be completely forgotten. And there is something rather extraordinary, and I don't think this is a good thing or a bad thing, it's just, I think, a fact, is that the Queen will be immortal. she will be part of history while we have history. I mean, partly because she is a queen, partly because she kind of broke lots of records and, 70 years queen. And that is there. So I think that is quite a big thing to trying to get your head around, and weird as well.
Mm.
That the minute she's died,
Yeah.
she's immortal, like the pharaohs, or like, the Chinese army and the king, the emperor with his Chinese army. She will always be remembered.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that today because I was cycling along the seafront. I live in a kind of Victorian seaside town, and I was thinking, we've got these I don't even know, I forgot what they're called, but the little kind of shelters that you have overlooking the sea.
Yeah,
and we have Victorian ones, and they're being restored. And I thought, oh, it's it's the Victorian sea shelter, they're being restored.
Victoria.
Yeah, and then I thought, oh, it's Queen Victoria, and then I thought of Queen Elizabeth, and how, in 50 or 100 years from now, there'll be other kind of cultural artifacts which are named after her, and which remind people, and as you say, kind of continue the history and the legacy of her reign.
Like the most recent one was the Queen Elizabeth line, the tube line. It's a very strange concept, really, but it's all about power, obviously.
Yeah, I wonder, you alluded to this just now in terms of the role of ritual in our kind of personal experiences of grief, but the way that, as well as having this function of kind of bringing people together and the kind of social aspect, there's also this role of ritual within our own kind of meaning making and our own individual kind of grief processes. So the idea that through kind of following these rituals, it helps us kind of transition into a world where the person is no longer there, where the person is dead, and accommodate the loss, perhaps. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that. I mean, you've mentioned continuing bonds, and it obviously relates to that. But it seems that, just thinking about ritual as a way of kind of allowing you to go into your grief, and allowing you to do the work of grief and kind of move through, without wanting to say move beyond, or obviously that's not what happens, but just the role of ritual in the accommodation of the loss.
So when you talk about accommodation, and I imagine most people listening know about that, it is what we talk about is that it's not that you forget and move on, but that we are wired and made to be adaptive, and that you learn, if you don't have prolonged grief disorder, you learn to find a way of coming to terms and living with the loss. And one of the ways of describing that is that you accommodate the loss. So you both feel the loss and feel the pain of the loss, and also let yourself live and love again and engage with life. And the kind of best theory that supports this, that again I have talked very often on these webinars, is the dual process by Strobe and Shute, and what she talks about, and I think what you talk about in the sense of having our own personal rituals, is that in the process of the emotional process of adapting to loss, we move between loss orientation, where we emote and grieve and feel the pain, and restoration orientation, where we allow ourselves to have a break from the pain, where we get on with living, where we kind of plan for the future and engage in the present. And it's the oscillation, the movement between the two, that allows us to adapt and accommodate the loss. And what you talk about with the ritual, of course, is that that's involved with loss orientation. Some people would have a ritual of going to the grave regularly, whether they mark it as once a month or whatever they do. Other people would have a ritual of, I always put flowers next to his photograph, and I do that at the beginning of each week, or I light a candle, or I always do something or wear something that connects me to him. And in doing that, you again allow yourself to go into your loss, face the reality of it, let the pain come through you. And incrementally over time, the pain is less, you do adjust. And then the memories are softer and warmer, they're not filled with pain. And so then the movement between loss and restoration in some ways is simpler, because the loss also is the love. And that they become part of you and inform you, and you talk to them and they become part of your life, rather than this very painful place that you kind of have to go to but you don't want to. And in the beginning of grieving, obviously, is completely all consuming.
Yeah, I immediately think of you know, the memory box and those kind of things that allow people to kind of go into their grief and provide that kind of trigger. Because I think over time as well, from my own experience anyway, is it can become more difficult to kind of access your grief if you don't have some sort of rituals. I mean, obviously your grief can always creep up on you and take you by surprise
and knock you.
Exactly. But I think if you want to, you know, personally, I feel like if I haven't been with my grief, I get this sense sometimes of like I want to make that connection. Yeah. So going to the cemetery or opening the memory box, it kind of enables you to go in to that deep space, which actually, you know, it's important that you do need to, you know, it's important for me anyway to kind of go there and be with those feelings sometimes.
Yeah. And I think I didn't say memory box. Memory boxes can be so precious and valuable, and making albums with photographs and memories, again, it can be incredibly valuable. I love everybody's comments.
It's hard to, I got to find that I can't look at both.
No,
but I've got some here on the Google Doc actually. There's a few people talking about remembering past losses. So Sarah said, I've noticed how the Queen's death has made me think of people I have lost, not in a re-triggering way, but there's, you know, a news event that they would have wanted to know. For instance, my grandmother would have wanted to know that the Queen had made it to 96 and that the crown had been passed on to Charles. So I suppose I feel connected to her again. It's kind of comforting and an example of continuing bonds.
Yeah.
And then other people saying, I see death and grief most days as a palliative care nurse, but I was surprised by just how sad I felt about the Queen's passing. I found myself transported back to the death of my granny 23 years ago and felt such profound grief rise up in me. I had to take time away from social media and stop watching the footage as it just felt too much.
Gosh. And I think what I'm interested in that is that also it puts us in touch with, you know, if you're a palliative care nurse, I can't believe that some of the loss, a lot of the loss is obviously to do with the Queen, but also living with loss, when you have a focus for it like that in the way that you kind of can't avoid, it will bring up, you know, all your experiences of loss, you know, unasked for, I would imagine. I've lost you. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I had to go onto mute. I've got
You've got a noisy background.
Children making noise downstairs.
Yeah.
And I wonder, actually, maybe we could talk about children, actually. So, you know, we talked a little bit when we did the Instagram Live, we talked a bit about how to talk to children about the Queen's death. And I think I have continued to think about, you know, all the school children who will be coming home having watched the news. You know, our children watched news, or one of our children watched Newsnight at primary school. The teacher, you know, they're talking to the teachers about what's happened, and it's going to raise a lot of questions, especially maybe for children who haven't had any prior experiences of bereavement, about death and dying and grief and what it is that people are doing, you know, when they see the ceremonies and, you know, when people were watching the funeral on Monday. Have you had any more questions or thoughts about that, Julia?
Yes, I mean, I've had lots of questions from you know, members of people following me on Instagram. And it's this thing that we naturally and instinctively want to protect our children. We don't want them to have to face what we see as difficult or scary, and we want them to have these innocent lives. And you know, what we know is that children need the same truth as all the adults around them, and certainly with something like this, there's no getting away from it. But I think you know, I think as you have said, this can be an opportunity so that we aren't such a death-fearing society, but that we're an fear-embracing society, that we think and talk about death like we do birth. And that we, once we have a kind of language around it and know what's natural to feel around it, then I think it really enables us to embrace life. And if we as adults model that for our children, so we answer their questions truthfully, we allow them to see us both sad and happy, that we move in and out. We answer their questions like, what does death look like? Or where's the Queen gone? You know, in the best way that we can, then they will grow up and have a less scary, sort of chilly relationship with death.
Yeah, and I wonder whether, you know, we are living in a society in which death and dying are just not the everyday things that they used to be. You know, historically, you know, death and dying was much more ubiquitous and unavoidable. And now we live in a world in which death and dying is to a large extent medicalized and happening in hospitals or nursing homes or hospices. And I think these kind of sort of public events like this are actually a good opportunity to, you know, to normalize and to talk about natural death and death from old age and the processes around that. And, you know, Catherine Mannix has been doing amazing work, you know, talking about that and highlighting the Queen's own kind of passage towards her death and the kind of natural stages you could see in that, in terms of her withdrawing from, you know, some of her duties and, you know, starting to slow down over the last kind of year or two. And I think that's really important, and that's a really that is an opportunity that we could start talking to our children about that as well, because ultimately we are all going to experience death and dying, like both for ourselves and for our loved ones. Bereavement and loss is more or less inevitable for most people. So if we can,
I think it's, I don't even know if it's more or less, it is inevitable, isn't it? Well, aren't we? I mean, we're certainly all going to die.
We're certainly going to die. I suppose if you're very unlucky and you die very young, maybe you'll die before you've been bereaved.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I do think it's all part and parcel of the same thing, isn't it? You know, if we can talk about grief and we can show and express our grief, and we can also talk about death and dying in these, you know, potentially easier for children, you know, these kind of situations where we're talking about the death of someone that they didn't personally know in most instances, obviously not when you're talking about the Queen's own family, but it is an opportunity to kind of to think about and have conversations as a family about the older people in your family as well. I mean, our kids, you know, immediately wanted to talk about that, you know, when
really
will
helpful.
die. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's important conversations that need to be had, really.
And kind of two things to add to that is, you know, that we have a kind of magical thinking, which is that if we don't think or talk about death, somehow it's going to protect us from it. So using this, as you say, as an opportunity to kind of recognize that death and dying is a reality that we're all going to face and is part of life. But also that the Queen had a good death. There isn't such a thing. There is bad deaths and tragic deaths and devastating deaths. And the Queen's is sad because people had a relationship with her, but she was 96. She lived a long and fruitful and meaningful life. She died at home in the place she wanted to die with her family. She worked 2 days before she died. She wasn't in pain. Well, I don't know if she was in pain, but I imagine even if she was, it was for a very short time. She had a really good death. And she actually role models thinking about death, because she planned her funeral always. So, I mean, this funeral was first put in place when she acceded to the throne, which it always is. And it's revisited and updated all the time. So that recently, in the last 10, 15 years, it's been updated every month. And she would have been part of those conversations. So she, you know, and we could obviously we're not going to have a state funeral, but we could start thinking about our own dying, talking to our families about our dying and whether we want to be, even the basics, like do we want to be cremated or buried, would be very helpful, I think.
Yeah, and I was reading earlier about you know, what used to happen in Victorian times, and apparently it was much more openly discussed and planned kind of what people wanted. So it said, dying was an open and ongoing conversation. So the family knew in advance what type of coffin the dying wanted, where they wanted to be buried, what they wanted to wear. Women actually made their own shrouds sometimes and would even include them in the wedding dowry. So it's like a completely different way of actually thinking about, the inevitable, which is the fact.
But I think modern obviously the two world wars kind of wiped out all the Queen Victorian sort of rituals and practices of mourning, because there was overwhelming amount of death and people just had to survive and get on. But also I think modern medicine has hidden death away, because it used to happen in the home. When someone got ill, basically they died. If they were lucky, they survived. But, a doctor's role was to sit and be with the family and witness the death. And certainly until the sort of 17th century, if someone was dying, there'd be a priest who walked down the street. And if people saw a viaticum, which was, going to bless the person that's dying, their private place of dying became a public room, because you would want as many people as possible to pray to improve their passage of death to heaven. And so death was then a very public thing, and that life was really about planning for your death, because life was so short. In the medieval times, 1 in 4 children died. In Victorian times, 1 in 6 children died. So we are the blessed recipients of amazing healthcare, but it is what's wiped out our capacity to manage death.
Yeah,
the right way of saying it.
And I think, I think immediately of, the Lancet Commission had this report this year on the value of death, which was led by Libby Salno, who's a really amazing sort of palliative medicine doctor and colleague. And the argument there is very much, we've seen this kind of over medicalization of death and dying, and of grief and bereavement as well. And it is time to try and create this shift in ours as kind of societal attitudes to death and dying, and kind of reclaim death and dying and bereavement as the sort of social processes they are, really.
And natural processes. It's not that you're failing when you die. It's not that the medical establishment, it can be sometimes, obviously, a medical failure, but particularly something like, a long life, it is not a failure. You're not losing a battle. It's a natural, inevitable process. There are lots of lovely comments.
There are, and we are going to go to those, but I've just got one last, perhaps slightly provocative question. But okay. I've been wondering, is our lack of grief rituals, we're seeing rituals now around the Queen's death, but as a society, we don't have, as we've been saying, we've lost a lot of the rituals which used to be in place, or as individuals, we often feel less connected to those. It is our lack of grief rituals and our failure to talk about and prepare for death, perhaps partly to blame for some of the difficulties that we might feel in our grief.
Oh, I think so, because I think, for many reasons, really, but I'd love to know what other people think. But in my experience with clients, one of the greatest sort of derailers of grief is regret. And all of the unanswered questions, all the rumination, all the what ifs, and things that you don't know, like did Dad want to be in a wicker coffin or an oak coffin, for instance? And so you're left with so much that can drive you literally mad, and people get this sort of ruminating, swirling set of unanswered questions and wonderings, and the sense of failure, and this guilt that's combined with regret, like, why didn't I? Why couldn't I? And it's also conflated with this feeling like, if I had done it right, maybe they wouldn't have died. A kind of magical thinking, I think, gets in the way as well. But if you really do know what someone wants, it really supports you. And if are they frightened of death? What do they think happens to them when they die? What and also what feel their kind of emotional legacy, not leaving you their pictures and your furniture, but what is the legacy of meaning and belief that you want to carry on down to your children and your grandchildren? What really matters to you? Having those conversations, having letters, maybe cards of what you would say to people on particular days, you know.
And more, I guess, more in relation to planning and thinking about your own death. We know from the research evidence that where there are those plans in place and where a family does feel that they know what the person wants, the bereavement is easier for them, and they're more likely to, less likely to have poor bereavement outcomes and things like prolonged grief disorder or, post-traumatic stress symptoms and things like that. So often, we know that people talk, it's funny in the UK because people say that they feel quite comfortable. Lots of people say they feel quite comfortable talking about death and dying, but that doesn't tend to translate into lots of people planning their funerals or planning for the end of their life or thinking about what care they would want, when they get very, very ill. So there is a bit of a mismatch there.
And also Tina's saying, if you haven't had the conversations, you are less protected psychologically also, but you have the fallings out in the family of one person will say dad wanted this, another one would say he wanted that, and that can cause real fracture in a family. And
I think from the medical perspective, sometimes what happens is there becomes too much of a focus on the advanced care planning and the kind of formal processes of filling out forms, where actually it's these broader conversations about what matters most to the person, and conversations around the kitchen table. I always think of them of, if we can kind of encourage people to have those kinds of conversations, I think that's kind of what it's really about. And then obviously the advanced care planning and the actual documentation and making sure that doctors and nurses know where you've written that down. That's the next step. If you feel able to do that, I think that's a hugely helpful thing for your family, as well as making it more likely that you'll get the death and the experience of dying that you want.
And I also think of it, and I don't know if other people agree, is that in having these conversations about yourself and, say, your partner to your children and your grandchildren, you are loving them into the future, because it is a way of taking care of them so that they don't have those concerns and worries and not knowings and possible fights. So it's an incredibly loving act to be able to do that.
I love that phrase, loving them into the future. I think I'll remember that. Let's go to the questions, because I'm aware I don't want to not leave enough time for the questions. So the first one here is about speaking with children. So this one's from Chrissia. So children are asking, where has the Queen gone now? How do you answer that?
So, I mean, I'm sure you've got an answer, but I would say that the Queen has died. So you have to use that word, not like she's gone to heaven or passed away. So I'd start with the Queen has died, and that means that her body doesn't work anymore, that her heart isn't working, and that if you touch her, she's cold, and her death is irreversible. She's not coming back. And then if you have a belief system, whether it's religion-based or you have some kind of belief that they've gone to a better place, then you could talk about that. And so I don't see there's any harm in talking about heaven or she's that twinkling star. And I think that's a way of having a continuing bond, that you can talk to the person. But children must know that concretely that the person has died. And they may ask you what death looks like. And I would take photographs of the person that's died, and you can keep them. When I worked in hospital, I took children to see their siblings that had died, because again, it's this whole, and obviously it's very individual and subjective. So I'm not telling people what to do, but certainly my experience with the same idea of what you don't tell children, they make up, and what they make up is worse than the truth, but also what children don't see, they picture for themselves, and that's much more frightening. So I had a little boy who didn't see his picture, and people talked about her body, and he started bedwetting, and they thought it was because he was bereaved, but actually it was because he thought she'd lost her head, because children are very literal. So he thought somehow someone had chopped off her head. So he had these awful images of a headless sister.
Thank you, Julie. I think that's really helpful. And I think, you know, my own children, my older child, she didn't attend our daughter's funeral. So my daughter was stillborn, as many people will know. And we did take lots of photos of the funeral. So we've kind of gone through those with her at different times when she's asked questions. And she actually also had that the belief about, as we said, her, you know, she asked about what happened to her, and we explained about her having died, and that her body was buried in the cemetery. And she also thought the same, I think, for some time, that it was just her body and it wasn't the rest of her, which is quite frightening. And it's only really when you talk through those things in a very open way, and you kind of probe what their understanding is, that some of that stuff will come out. But I totally
and get them
agree.
to draw pictures.
Yeah.
And Emily's saying, I saw my mum's body. I really wish I hadn't. Depends on how the person has died. I agree. I mean, I can understand that it's very difficult if they've died in a particular way.
And I think also, you know, if it's also, if you're a parent, I think, and you're thinking about your own children, maybe a sibling has died. For me anyway, a big factor was, what can I actually deal with? Because I just couldn't at that time deal with bringing my child to meet her sister. It was just too much for me. And you can't, I don't think you should beat yourself up about that either. I think if it's too much and you can't do it at that time, you know, that's okay as well. Let's go on to another.
Compassion is key.
Yes, definitely. Here's one. So this one is about bittersweet moments. So this is Sana says, can you please talk about bittersweet moments in our lives when you have or gain one thing while losing or missing another? I've seen this happening with having a new king and the death of the Queen.
I think that's such an interesting question. I mean, I think so. You know, working with someone, what reminds me of is going back on holiday this summer to a place without the person that's died, but with the rest of the family. Place is very bittersweet. It's painful that that person is no longer with them, but also there are these lovely memories of walking up mountains, swimming in the sea, of laughter around the table. And so they didn't want to go to block it, and I think they're right. But there's this, you know, wherever we have one feeling, we have the other often. But yeah, it's very bittersweet. It's very connected, because they were their happiest memories, because they were holidays, as they often are. I mean, people have big fights on holidays too, but you know, it's their special times, and so it was a special place. Can you think of one?
I suppose I started thinking about when a kind of an old grief or an old bereavement, and like, you know, my father died when I was 15, and you know, you have these moments in your life, you know, like when you have your first child, say, and you think about them and you kind of revisit your grief. And it's not a purely sad thing. It's also a remembrance of them and an imagining of what they might have said, or of the grandfather that they might have been. It's not I suppose in that sense it's a bittersweet, because you're sort of appreciating who they were and what they might have brought, and there's a joy and a happiness in the moment as well.
That's a very good example.
Here we go. Here's one. We touched on this a little bit, but here's someone saying, how do we cope when other people experience the Queen's death in a greater or lesser way than yourself? I find myself justifying why I feel very sad, as much for the King and the rest of the royal family as for the Queen's good death. Surely most of us can at least relate to the family who has to go through so many rituals before they can actually say goodbye.
I mean, I think that my first kind of thought for you is to give yourself permission to feel what you feel, and to be self-compassionate, that whatever you're feeling and the extent of what you're feeling is legitimate, and to really let yourself know that. And also, of course, we want to be supported and affirmed by the people around us. So it can feel quite disconcerting when others are feeling very differently, because or they can think we're feeling wrong, or that what we're feeling is wrong. So I think the big thing is, like we said before, there isn't a right or a wrong way, and to legitimize all the very big differences that there are between close friends, family members, and strangers.
Mm.
And it may be also, just to add, a particular time in your life. You may feel something completely different if this happened 6 months ago. There are other things that obviously influence us.
I suppose it makes me think of the importance of being kind to each other and trying to be understanding and not be judgmental. But I appreciate it. It can be hard to maintain that if you feel that other people are not treating you the same way.
And I think there's that thing, gosh, that maybe this is a bit mean, but that if you're really hurting and really in pain, it's much harder. I mean, this is true of me, okay, I'll talk about me. It's much harder for me to be generous and non-judgmental when I'm in a really bad place than when I'm in quite a good, emotionally robust place. Because when I'm well and happy, I have lots of resources and I'm calm. And so that allows me to have the space to not only think about what my response is, but to think about where they came from and have empathy and kind of tell myself a bigger story of what's really going on. And when I'm upset and distressed and angry and hurting, my brain works differently. So my capacity to think and process and reflect is completely switched off. But also I'm coming from a hurting place, which often is expressed as anger. So it kind of hits out at other people. And I think so I think we need to account for that in ourselves and in those around us.
Yeah, thank you. Here's one from Sue, who's a humanist funeral celebrant.
Sue, are you the soul? Are you the one that's talking about that you work with people to get their souls? It's such an interesting thing. I thought you're a soul midwife. Oh, that's Sally. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Sorry to interrupt.
It's okay. Sue is a humanist funeral celebrant. So she says, in funeral ceremonies I've conducted this week, I felt compelled to mention the grieving of another family, i.e. the royal family. So families have seemed to find it comforting, but I wonder what others think. I would hate it to have in any way diminish the family's loss.
I mean, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's that you'll have a subjective response, and for some it would seem strange not to acknowledge it and allow all of us, whatever our birth and our position, to be connected as human beings at a time of great grief, and that there's something connecting and binding and warming about that. And for others, their reaction may be different, but that's how I take what you're saying, is that fundamentally we're all human beings and we're allowed to feel sad, and that we need to connect and acknowledge each other.
Yeah, and grief, it does connect you, doesn't it? Because, as we keep saying, it's something we're all going to experience. And I also think for me anyway, it's this sense of grief is the one constant that, going back through time, we've all grieved, we've all experienced those losses. So I think, I think it's actually a lovely image. I'm sure it probably depends on how it's said, but it sounds like the families you're working with are receiving that as you intend. So I think it's nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
This is one about the use of words and the kind of language that's being used, I suppose, especially in the media. But as a donor, a counsellor in Leeds, I'm noticing the use of the word past rather than died.
I know.
Do you think that's helpful?
No, Donna, no. I do not. It really annoys me. I mean, I don't know why I get annoyed by it, but lost is the one I particularly hate. Nobody's got lost. And maybe they have gone to heaven, if you believe in that. But I just think the metaphors that in some way meant to soften the reality of the death actually disconnect us from death and disconnect us from the reality of it, which is what we need to focus on in order to be able to come to terms with it. And that when we block it and do things that put up a sort of carapace defending against it, we also block our capacity to fully grieve.
And I do think, you know, in the media especially, there's almost, you know, I think it's their responsibility to actually use the D words.
So do I. That's what the truth is.
It's very important. I think if you're working therapeutically with you know, a family or a patient in palliative care, I think then it becomes a little bit more tricky, because you might want to use the words which the family is using, or use the words which the person is comfortable using when they're talking about their own death. But I certainly think in the media there's not really any excuse for using words like past, which don't resound, you know, they don't chime with everyone either. So yeah, better to stick to the facts. I'm very sad that we've almost come to the end, but I've really we did get through most of the questions, although not all. And I
love really, the chat so much.
I do, and
we're in a room together. I just want to read them all.
I do as well. In fact, yeah, I might try and
about age
keep
concern.
a copy so we can read them all afterwards.
Yeah, and the Death Cafes and the Susan Cain's book. I've tried to interview her. She hasn't replied to me. Can't think why.
Maybe it will get to her now after you've said that in public.
Any of you listening can get to her too.
I've so enjoyed talking with you, Julia, and I hope that other people tuning in have found it helpful and interesting. Is there anything you'd like to say as a way of kind of rounding up our conversation today?
I mean, I think I've loved being with people again, and thank you for being so engaged in the comments, and you're all so many of you doing wonderful work, and that's so lovely and important and great to see. So thank you for participating. Particularly take care of yourselves this evening if this has brought up feelings for you, and be kind to yourself. Do something that feels like it's soothing and a treat and comforting. And I love being part of the Good Grief. I think you do amazing work, and I'm kind of honoured to be a part of it. So thank you, Lucy, and thank you for your lovely questions.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks so much, Julia, as always. Take care, everybody, and have a nice evening. And I hope to see you again at Good Grief in the future.